A 2-month-old baby wakes up at 3 a.m. and begins to cry. Let's imagine that his mother comes in and, during the next half hour, the baby happily feeds in her arms while she looks at him affectionately, caresses him, and shows how happy she is to see him even in the middle of the night, even though she had to wake up for it. Afterward, the baby, satisfied from feeding and from his mother's love, falls back asleep peacefully. Now, let's suppose that another 2-month-old baby also wakes up crying in the middle of the night, but in this case, an angry mother comes to pick him up, very angry and irritated. A mother who has just fallen asleep after having a strong argument with her husband. She grabs him roughly and says, "Be quiet, I can't waste time on you. Let's finish this as quickly as possible." The baby tenses up, and while he is feeding, his mother looks at him with indifference, as she almost always pays him very little attention. As she remembers the argument she just had with her husband, she becomes increasingly restless. The baby inevitably senses this tension, becomes tense, and stops feeding. "Well, that was all you wanted. That's enough. It's over," the mother says harshly and places him back in his crib and walks away. The baby is left crying until, exhausted, he eventually falls asleep. These are two very different scenes, two types of interaction that, if repeated again and again, end up showing the baby or teaching him very different feelings about himself and about everyone around him. This is where the great difference lies between secure and insecure attachment. In the case of the first baby, he learns that people perceive his needs, take them into account, and can even help him satisfy them. Meanwhile, the second baby learns that no one cares, that no one really looks after him, that he cannot rely much on others, and that his efforts will ultimately fail. Throughout our lives, all of us go through both types of situations, but what truly matters is which one predominates, what is repeated most often in our lives. In this way, mothers, fathers, and caregivers impart, both consciously and unconsciously, the most important emotional lessons of life. They activate the sense of either security or insecurity, the degree of dependence or independence we will have in the future, which determines what psychology calls basic trust or basic mistrust. All this emotional learning begins in the earliest moments of life, and repetition, that is, continuing to receive these types of messages over the years, will shape our entire personality, nothing less. During the first 3 or 4 years of life, babies' brains grow at a pace that will never be repeated again. This is a key period for emotional learning. In this episode, we're going to talk about avoidant attachment, and I want to show you that although the impact of this early learning is very, very deep, it can be remedied, and we have the power to do so ourselves now that we are adults. Would you like to know how? Let's begin. Insecure-Avoidant Attachment is the opposite of anxious attachment, the type of attachment I discussed in the previous episode of the same podcast, which you can listen to if you'd like to learn more about it. Now, we're going to look at what happened in childhood for this attachment style, the avoidant one we're discussing today. To develop, if during childhood we experience a lack of affection or a lack of availability from our caregivers, mother, father, etc., which may happen for various reasons, such as the death of a family member, a caregiver's depression, or excessive workload, for example, if the person in charge of us worked all day, this feeling of lack of affection or availability can arise. When a child is very young and feels that their mother or primary caregiver is not available, they may grow up with a sense that they are a burden and will likely begin to ignore their own needs. In avoidant attachment, the caregiver, mother, father, or any caregiver, may feed, bathe, and physically care for the baby. However, they may feel frightened by the child's emotions, not consider them important, or become nervous, anxious, or insecure in response to them, and therefore reject or fail to listen to any of those emotions. This is not out of malice, but because they genuinely don't know how to soothe them, how to meet them, or because it scares them. Perhaps no one soothed them either when they were children. So now, they don't know how to do it with the child in front of them. Of course, this has consequences. In order to survive, and considering that survival requires staying close to the caregiver, the baby has to renounce their emotions. The cost is emotional disconnection. That is the great price paid to survive. Emotional disconnection means that, in order not to be rejected, the child must stop showing or expressing emotions. But as this happens, they also stop feeling them. For example, a girl has a headache and her mother ignores her, but when she says, "Mom, My head doesn't hurt anymore. Her mother comes close to her again. In this way, the child learns to stop crying when something hurts or to stop expressing any emotion in order for her mother to come near again. In adulthood, this emotional disconnection caused by avoidant attachment has consequences. We see adults who have difficulty feeling, naming, or expressing their emotions. They may not know when they are angry or sad or how to navigate the emotional world, which feels overwhelming to them. They may also appear very self-sufficient and confident because there is a denial of vulnerability and they don't know how to connect with their emotions. It is actually a kind of false security, since that apparent independence or self-sufficiency often reflects an inability to recognize or connect with their feelings. As a result, they may do things without really knowing what they want, what they fear, or what they need. That is, they cannot make use of the wisdom of their emotions to make decisions or to be authentic and consistent with themselves. So they are people who, for example, will think they're not afraid, that nothing scares them, that they don't get sad, or that they face any problem in a completely pragmatic and practical way, setting aside any hint of suffering or fear, as if they locked it away in a drawer. So they say, well, life is like that, what can you do? There's a problem, but life goes on. You have to deal with it, and that's just how it is. They are the kind of people who minimize the importance of painful issues, but in reality, it's because they don't know how to face them. On the other hand, unlike people with anxious ambivalent attachment, the type I talked about in the previous episode, avoidant attachment tends to have a very positive idea of the self, generally a high self-esteem because they are autonomous, but it may come with a somewhat negative view of others. Academic settings, for example, and work are areas where people with avoidant attachment feel secure because they have generally developed their rational abilities much more than their emotional ones. However, emotional skills, especially those involved in intimate relationships, are where these individuals struggle most because relationships are inherently charged with affection and are, above all, emotional territory. Naturally, this terrain is difficult for them. These individuals tend to avoid intimacy at all costs because they don't know what to do with their emotions. As a result, they may shift from being cold and seemingly in control to a sudden emotional outburst in which they cry intensely and cannot regulate their feelings. This can be quite common in someone with this type of attachment. Another key characteristic is that people with this attachment style can maintain very stable relationships as long as there isn't too much closeness or dependence. But if there starts to be too much intimacy, they may become distressed because they're getting closer to their emotional world, and they might even end the relationship and walk away, not because they don't love the other person or fear commitment, but because they are beginning to feel, and feeling is very difficult for them to manage. This is especially evident in romantic and sexual relationships. People with this attachment style often feel great anxiety about losing the person they love, and believe that by not showing their emotions, not expressing how they feel, or minimizing their feelings, they can protect themselves from suffering. They tend to avoid deep and genuine conversations, and instead of expressing their dissatisfaction with words, they may distance themselves, ignore the issue, or pretend it doesn't matter, when internally there is enormous emotional chaos. Let's look at some of the avoidance tools commonly used by people with this type of attachment. Point number 1, saying or thinking, I'm not ready for commitment, but still stay with their partner anyway, sometimes for years. 2, focusing on small imperfections in the other person, their way of speaking, dressing, eating, or anything else, and letting those minor flaws interfere with what they feel for that person. 3, continuing to think about an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, even when there is nothing particularly attractive about that person anymore. This is simply a mechanism to avoid the overwhelming feeling of present-day love, or seducing other people in an attempt to introduce insecurity into the relationship, or not saying, I love you, but imply it instead, because there is in fact love or desire, even if it is denied out of fear. Another avoidance strategy can be disappearing or withdrawing when things are going well. For example, not calling for a long time after a very beautiful, romantic, or emotionally intense encounter. Or establishing relationships that have no future, such as with someone who is married or emotionally committed to another person. Another avoidance tool can be keeping secrets, being confusing, or acting mysterious in order to maintain a sense of independence. Or avoiding physical closeness, For example, not wanting to share a bed, refusing intimacy, or even walking ahead of the other person. These are all small behaviors that, although the person does want to bond with the other, function as avoidance strategies that allow them to remain in a place that feels safe. In summary, I want to list here the main characteristics of people with avoidant attachment, and I'd like you to look inward and see whether you recognize yourself or someone you know in these traits I'm about to describe. There are 6 major traits. Number 1, repression of one's own needs and a deep emotional disconnection. These are people who are practically incapable of expressing their emotions, but not only expressing them, also feeling or identifying them. It's hard for them to say, here I feel sad, or here I feel happy. There's a sense of needing to withdraw emotionally from everything and everyone in order to feel safe. Emotional closeness feels dangerous, and this can make them appear insensitive toward others or even indifferent to their own feelings. Number 2, they show a false sense of independence. They tend to have superficial relationships and feel uncomfortable with highly intimate connections because that would make them dependent, and they don't want that. Number 3, their main strategy is intellectualization as a way to cope with uncertainty and lack of affection. Everything becomes intellectualized. Feelings are pushed aside. Persistent, ruminative thinking appears in the form of self-reflection that actually leads nowhere and only generates discomfort. It's constant thinking, with no emotional component. That is a defense mechanism. Point number 4. As adults, they don't allow themselves to show distress so as not to be a burden or inconvenience to others, which is how they truly feel inside. So they tend to control their anger and hide their discomfort. 5. They disconnect from their own needs out of fear that expressing them could break the relationship. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. So they tend to keep everything under control, everything tucked away and contained. But this will inevitably lead to exhaustion. I become exhausted from hiding the needs I have. Yet this type of insecure attachment will try at all costs to conceal those needs so that the bond doesn't break. And point number 6, the last one, is that their way of regulating themselves, that is, of feeling better, is through activities that involve a great deal of effort, whether physical or mental. For example, studying a lot, doing a lot of sports, or using substances that allow them not to feel anxiety, such as drugs. For instance, if you identified with any of these traits, let's now look at what can be done about all of this. I'd like to share some small tips or recommendations for working with avoidant attachment. But first, I want to pause. I want to pause because I need to say that there may be other ways of working with this type of attachment. However, the one I know most deeply, and I would even say the most effective, is psychological therapy. People with avoidant attachment often come to therapy with very little trust in the therapist. It's very common to hear things like, "And what is this for?" Since they are focused on the usefulness and practicality of psychotherapy rather than on the emotional aspect. The therapeutic process aims to help them gradually experience and understand their emotions at a pace they can tolerate, of course. In other words, you have to learn to feel safe and to trust your emotions in order to use them in your intimate relationships if you are a person with insecure, avoidant attachment. It is very important, that you learn to identify what you feel in your relationships with others, what it means to lose someone, what you need from others, that you learn not to run away when intimacy appears or when another person gets close to you, that you rediscover the beauty of the emotional world, and that you learn that it is not dangerous to feel. It is also very important for these individuals to learn to let themselves be cared for, since this excessive independence actually cries out for the affection that the person does not dare or does not know how to ask for. Of course, at first it may feel aversive for someone with insecure attachment when another person tries to care for them, but it is important that little by little they begin to connect with their vulnerability, because deep down they are not emotionally self-sufficient. They only seem to be and wish to be. But no one is 100% self-sufficient, at least not emotionally. Human beings simply are not. What we must keep in mind about this type of attachment is that these individuals were once children who did not receive as much help or love when they asked for it, and they probably don't even remember that it was this way. Therefore, in therapy, what we listen for is related to these needs for love and affection, which this type of person usually tend to rationalize, almost as if everything were coldly calculated. That's why, in therapy, we begin to decode what they might be feeling, giving space to emotion rather than focusing only on rational thought, and instead exploring what is happening at the emotional level. We try to set aside, a bit, the explanation or logical reasoning that these individuals are much more comfortable with, because that is something they already know how to do. So, in summary, therapy for this type of insecure-avoidant attachment is about helping the person rediscover the whole range of colors and emotions that have gone unnoticed within them, and that can truly bring much more richness and color to their life. That's it for today's episode. Thank you, and subscribe for more videos.